Hey guys, section 8.3, the social impact of the Industrial Revolution. I'm here in Maisie's room hanging out with Maisie. To be here with us, she is in a mood this morning, so we'll see how easily we'll be able to talk about the social impact of the Industrial Revolution with her in here. Are you excited about this? Yes? Yeah? Here. He's your friend. Okay. So we'll see how easily this goes. The menu. There is a lot going on with this section. It's a very important section because it discusses basically, what did the Industrial Revolution look like, and then maybe more importantly for the nature of AP, how it impacts social dynamics. Am I going to be able to talk here? Can I talk to the sophomores? Yeah? We'll see. The Industrial Revolution. Again, 8.1 basically talked about what it was, the creation of these factories, so that it's the widespread manufacturing of goods that shift from machine based from human based, but that shouldn't negate the fact that there was a huge human impact in the Industrial Revolution, starting with general working conditions, not only for adults, but also for children. You have a lot of kids who are put to work in the Industrial Revolution in these factories, which are terrible conditions, usually very cold, not insulated buildings, poor lighting, not very sanitary, very dirty, messy, and then mind-numbing, back-breaking labor. And in this case, you have a lot of children who are working on putting small pieces together for what I'm not sure. But you notice not only are they working in difficult conditions environmentally, but also subjected to discipline if need be. And there's some stories that we'll discuss in class. Just kind of an example is that some children, if they while working, go to sleep while working, some of the foremen and bosses basically of the factory would set up a big crate with ice cold water, and they would chain the kids to the they would actually they put the kid, chain the kid up upside down, drop him into the cold water to wake him up or her up. So these are incredibly poor conditions, incredibly difficult conditions for children to work in. They're primarily textile factories. So textiles are basically any sort of cloth or clothing. And the vast majority of these factories were textile to create and make clothes generated from these power looms, these machines that children would be put to work on. And many children would be assigned to these places because if the machine broke, children would have tiny hands to be able to reach in there and fix the machine if need be. And that could lead to disastrous situations as well, as we'll look at down the road. So, bad conditions, yes, I hear you, in the context of textile factories. And as you can see again, poor conditions, poor air to breathe in, the working conditions were bad. And again, in class, we'll talk about some more specific examples of that. So it's all part of the process of urbanization, in which people are moving from rural areas to the cities to work in these factories. It is the largest population transfer in human history. This transition from rural manufacturing, the cottage industry, agricultural industries, to cities and factories. Yeah, 1 second. Okay, not everyone's leaving the country, right? It's not that simple. People are staying behind in the country, obviously to work agricultural jobs, but there are lots less than there used to be, and you see a lot more moving to the cities. Cities at first were created and built around water sources because the earliest factories had to be powered by water. But when you get the invention of the steam engine to power these machines with coal, then you're going to start seeing factories be built everywhere and not just on water sources. This is the birth of factory towns and industrial centers. Manchester in England is probably the best example of a city that explodes with population because of all these factories being built. 1785, there were 3 British cities with more than 50,000 people. So in context, Richmond has 30,000. only 3 that had more than 50,000. 50,000, think like Owensboro or Bowling Green, a bigger city. But by 1820, you have 31 cities that had more than 50,000 people. So that's in the course of what? 35 years? You have 28 more cities that go to that threshold. That's an incredible growth of population density in those areas. It's not necessarily we're adding population, although that's going up a little bit. The bigger story is that we are adding people in smaller or in more tight areas, right? So I'm going to take a little time out because Maisie is losing her mind. So after we get back, we'll look at the impact on urban cities. Okay, we're back. I think Maisie is napping because she was she had a temper. So she's not asleep. But she might be. We'll see. Well, I don't know. Let's talk about urbanization. So, with so many people moving to cities, city governments really have no idea what to do with this huge population influx. So what many of the factories do is that they construct their own tenement apartment buildings close to their factory. So when the families that are looking for work move to the cities, they live in these factory apartments. These places are trash. Like, I lived in a trash dorm when I was in college. Like, cockroaches were crawling out of the ceiling. It happened. But these places takes the cake. You've got, and in some cases, a dozen people, family members, living in, say, a room that's half the size of our classroom, right? And not only interiorly, I don't know if that's a word, not only on the inside were these difficult places to live, but on the outside, the conditions were very poor. No internal or indoor plumbing. The sanitation system, basically, the removal of waste was in some cases dumping outside of your window or down on the streets. Muddy streets. You would certainly see that conditions were absolutely horrendous. And because of that, disease spread quickly. And in London, in particular, in the year, let's see if I can get fancy here today. Yes, I can. In the year 1832, we have a huge outbreak of cholera. In cholera, we talked about smallpox a little bit in the fall. Cholera is our new disease to watch. It is spread due to poop in your water, right? Bad water creating all sorts of symptoms and conditions that we don't want to talk about. But that's kind of what happened, and cholera became known as King Cholera because it was so present in British urban society. So the conditions are absolutely poor in these cities. Working conditions are awful. Living conditions are awful. It's bad. So how does that impact socially the dynamics of a social environment? So here we're kind of looking again at our social pyramid and how it's kind of changing over time because the Industrial Revolution is such a transformative event. The first thing we look at is family dynamics, so how the family interact. So under the cottage industry and also just in rural agricultural lifestyles, the family was the economic unit. You lived with your family and worked with your family. There wasn't any going away to work. Your work was in your home. The cottage industry, obviously, but even working out in the fields in these villages and manors back in the day, medieval, early modern Europe, your family was your economic unit. You lived with them, you worked with them. However, the Industrial Revolution, kind of the big change is that it's taking work out of the home. So now we have to go places to go to work. When the merchants decide, when the bourgeoisie decides, we're going to take the cottage industry, rural industries, and put it all into one central location, now the labor has to go there. So the work is taken outside of the home. Thus, family dynamics change. So one thing we start seeing, this is where economics plays a role, is that as factory wages for skilled adult males rose, a adult male with a certain skill, a blacksmith or whatever, right? You need a skill, but if they had a certain skill that could be valuable in a factory setting, their wages would rise. Okay, their wages, what they were paid, would rise, and then the women and children who did not have such skills would be separated from them in the workplace. So work took on a different meaning. The women and children would work in different places, and then the skilled adult males, those who had skills, would be working somewhere else in the factory, and their wages would be higher. So now we see a separation of the family outside of the home. As that continues, and as adult males see their wages go up, and that's one thing about the Industrial Revolution that goes a little underreported, is that wages go up for skilled males. So as that happens, as wages go up, the women, the mothers, start to decide, well, we're making enough money in this setting, why don't I just stay home with the kids? And therefore, the gender-determined roles at home and domestic life emerge slowly. Some of you all in your Enlightenment essays talked about that women always stayed home with the kids while the men went and worked. During the Enlightenment, that's not true. Basically, everyone was at home, traditionally. Though jobs would be different, okay? They would be separate, but they would be complementary, meaning that they would have different tasks at home, but everyone was staying home, right, in this rural agricultural setting. So they were complementary. They worked together, but they were separate. But now, married women are going to be expected to work inside of the home, granted if their husbands make enough money to support them. So the women will stay at home, take care of the kids, the man goes to work, and thus you have a breakdown of the family dynamic, which was so solid and so tight potentially before the Industrial Revolution, now has fissured and broken a little bit. Now, that doesn't even begin to talk about single women or widows. Obviously, to support themselves and their families, they're going to have to work. So these women are going to take extraordinarily unskilled positions in factories, things that you can just go in there today and do, menial labor perhaps. They're going to take jobs that are unskilled, and those jobs will have poor wages. So women, single women, really get hurt in this process, and widows as well, because there is no skilled worker to support them. Doesn't mean that the women can't find and develop skills of their own, but it does happen. But at least entry level, if they've been, say, if they're a widow, they're going to have to now go into work, and then their kids, well, they might have to work too. Because one thing that's not said here is, of course, kids also stay home, but if need be, will work as well. Now, there's our ladies who are working and looking like they're having a lot of fun while doing so. One thing that also happens in urban areas is that you have the growth of, in some areas, prostitution. And you have some women who, if that factory wage is not enough, will resort to desperate measures to do that. So if you've seen the movie Les Mis, or the play, I should say, it's not a movie, it's a play, then you might have a little bit of insight on that. So, again, family dynamics certainly changing. Now, social classes are also changing. We are entering a point of time where the clergy and the landed nobility, the nobility who grew basically powerful in the land, are now largely irrelevant. So our top two, basically, remember that pyramid that we had, and we had the king, and we had, the clergy and whatnot, those top positions are going down. Now, there's a couple of exceptions. The gentry in England and the boyars in Russia, nobility in those two countries, they have power in many cases, but for different reasons. The gentry, of course, represented in Parliament, can design laws to help them as best they can. The boyars have local control of their estates in Russia, where serfdom is still in place. So the nobles still have local control and can kind of control whatever goes on there. So it's very different. Gentry do it through government, the boyars through traditional economic structures. But in this case, the clergy and the nobility across the continent of Europe, France, Prussia, Austria, and whatnot, are getting to be where they're irrelevant. Now, who is becoming relevant? Well, it's the bourgeoisie. Okay, so I froze there for a second. Are we still good? Yeah, we're still here. The bourgeoisie, the middle class. So as the Industrial Revolution spreads, okay, the bourgeoisie become more and more significant. We talked about in 8.2 kind of why that is. But inside of the bourgeoisie, you're going to start to see a splintering, a separation, a social pyramid inside of the bourgeoisie itself. You're going to have the upper bourgeoisie, who's going to be the bankers, merchants, industrialists, so the factory owners. And these men, women, start to look a little bit like the nobility of the past. They're going to begin to imitate some of the old aristocracy with their lifestyle. You have what's called the petite bourgeoisie, the little bourgeoisie. Small industrialists, professional men. You have like lawyers, doctors, people like that who are in a different aspect of the bourgeoisie. So in the bourgeoisie, most of your money is here, and then the key word here is professional. For the petite bourgeoisie, they have a role that they train for, lawyers, doctors, teachers to a degree, but they certainly do not see themselves in industries that are making bukus of cash. So that's where the upper bourgeoisie develop, and they start to look like the nobility. So again, the bourgeoisie is starting to splinter. Now, at the bottom, you have what's called the proletariat. This is different than not equals to. This is not peasants. Okay? Think urban poor from the French Revolution, the street rats. That's the closest comparison here. But this is the working class. They earn a wage and live in poor housing in the city. So we've already talked about them at length in this podcast. Many are poor peasants who have migrated to the city. So again, these are people who have left the rural settings and have come in. We call them the working class, urban poor. Technical term that we'll use in context for 8.4 is proletariat. Okay, proletariat. They're kind of the natural rival to the bourgeoisie. So this is basically the masses who have the seats in the factories that do the work. Poor working conditions. Long hours in factories, many of them working 16 hours a day. Brutal and unsafe conditions. 16 hours a day and only a 30-minute break. Poor lighting, poor breathing air. Not only in factories, but also in coal mines, which bring all sorts of new challenges. It is a very difficult lifestyle. We also see countries and urban governments start to open poorhouses to care for the unemployed. So people who do not have a job, we start to see urban governments kind of try to adjust for those conditions. So we got a couple of snarky cartoons here. Old boy here says machinery is very productive and I own it. That's why I'm rich. And the voices of the proletariat here say, hey, you didn't build it. That's us. Sorry, I just hit the computer. You didn't build it. You don't operate it. You don't work at all. And yet all of our hard work, the results are basically going to you. Now, granted, guy might have bought it. He pays the wages. Let's not like dump on this guy totally. But the argument here is these guys do the work, right? These guys, okay? And this guy, that's totally not working. That guy with the glasses, old money bags, gets the results of it. We're going to look at this in class. This is a fascinating cartoon. The capitalist pyramid, okay? The argument here is that the working class holds up the entire system. So as they work in factories to produce products that power the economy, the monarchies and the government rules them, the clergy fools them, the armies will shoot at them, and then the rich, the bourgeoisie, make the money that these guys work hard to create. And then, we have someone who is either sleeping or worse. So we're going to look at this chart again, but again, it's the argument that the proletariat's the ones that power the economy. So it's something to look out for. Now, you're inevitably going to see conflict between these two sides. This is from a movie called Office Space. Watch it when you're 17. It's awesome. Again, you have to be 17. Unions formed to resist exploitation of the proletariat by business owners. So you have groups of workers who start to band together to make sure that they're treated well. Of course, that's a big part of our modern economy. Something that was present before the Industrial Revolution, but certainly will be more popular after. They were banned in England, but allowed again in 1824. We'll talk about Parliament here in a second. You have a group of people in England who politically tried to bring rights to workers. They're called the Chartists. We'll talk about them more in depth later. But they're trying to do things that bring rights to workers. And what they're bringing, of course, like I said, we'll talk about later, but just to give you a shout out for them there. And then we had the Luddites, and you might have heard this term before. These are workers who see machines as replacing them and taking their jobs, so they try to beat up machines and destroy them. They're pretty awesome. The Luddite. So the Luddite, you'll hear that term given to someone who rejects like technological advances. So if you know someone, maybe you've got a parent or grandparent who still has like a flip phone, right? Not that they're not cool, but yeah, it's so like 2006. So again, kind of some conflict between labor and capital. And they'd attack factories and destroy machines. Fun times. Now, what's Parliament do about all of these struggles and changes? Something to look out for. And again, in Unit 9, we'll kind of look at this again. What does Parliament do to try and fix the problems that are created from industrialization? Well, the first thing is that they're going to create laws to protect the well-being of the factory worker. A little bit ironic because a lot of people in Parliament are from the noble class or the higher classes, and yet Parliament's going to start looking out, in England at least, for the factory worker. A couple of pieces of legislation. This one's the biggest one, probably the one to remember, is the Factory Act, 1833. It limits working hours, so factories can only make people work for so long. You can go more in depth. If someone asked me in class, we'll look at it. We might go through that in class anyway. The problem with this is that when you say you do have a situation where you have all your family working at the same factory for one reason or another, and they're in the same environment. But when you tell women and children that they can't work as long as the man, now all of a sudden the woman and child are separated from the man even more, right? The man's working more. Say the men and women are working, the children can't work as long now. Dang, right? I mean, where are they going to go for 3 hours before mom and dad come home? There's a great story about alcohol. Well, I want to say great story about alcoholism, but there's a story about a group of children in the Industrial Revolution, and the man is at a tavern, and he sees these children, age 6 and 7, like, come into the tavern after getting off work. And this, of course, their parents probably still working. Or they're orphans, one of the two, and they come in up to the tavern and jump up to the bar and down a few beers, right? 6 and 7 years old, sounds like a thing to do. There were no laws against underage drinking, so yeah, why not, right? Yeah, whatever. The Mines Act, you can read that there, blah, blah, blah. No child labor in the mines, that's fun. The Factory Act of 1847, no boys or women or children or women in the factory over 10 hours. So again, those things are placed there. Now, kind of to sum up the Industrial Revolution a little bit. Again, in class, we'll be doing a lot more with it, but an evaluation. Long term, it's kind of a good thing, right? We look at the problems in the short term, the working conditions and living conditions and exploitation and things like that, but the Industrial Revolution actually is a good thing. How can we say that? Well, cheaper, high-quality goods available in larger supplies. People make more stuff, and that drives the cost of basic goods down, like clothing and basic manufactured goods. If there are more of them, if the supply's up, then the price is going to be down. So that's a good thing. Wages are going to go up incredibly. All of a sudden, you're not depending on the harvest to come through with you, which, as we've seen, is no sure bet. Now your wages are consistent, and with the wealth entering society thanks to industrialization, wages are going to go up 50%. So that's a good thing. And the governments are going to start intervening to protect the rights of the working class, the proletariat. So some might argue that's a bad thing, but it does protect the rights of the working class so that the business class or the bourgeoisie can't exploit them as much as they want. Now, negatives. Obviously, housing is poor in urban areas. The workers, for the most part, do not share equitably in the massive wealth that's produced, so income inequality begins to grow. But your long-term effects, if we look at this macro-wise, in a big picture, population is going to go up because of more supplies out there. It's going to help people live longer in that regard. Again, long-term, right? Once we fix kind of the housing problems and the cholera issues and things like that, sanitation, longer life expectancy, eventually lower infant mortality. So all of these things are happening because of the Industrial Revolution. Your world today is a product of the Industrial Revolution. I don't have my phone on me, but your phone, this computer I'm doing this on, all products of an industrial setting. What else do I have? So there's other things, but I'm going to get out of here for you. So yes, we look at the poor conditions and no, I don't. I mean, we look at poor conditions like these. You know, you have exploitation and poor living conditions. You have exploitation of social classes. Again, interpretation. But you have those negatives. But at the end of the day, you do have positives, and our modern world is based on this movement. So the last thing I would tell you is that socially, it impacts an incredible amount. The bourgeoisie starts to develop its strength and starts to splinter into different directions, but also you have the family dynamics, which change as well. So that's 8.3. Thanks for being patient and going through. It's a big one, and then we will restate and revisit many of these issues when we start the IR in class. So peace, and continue to have a good break. Bye-bye.